to read something that he wrote a long time ago, about 1948. And if you remember what was happening in 1948, who can remind me what was happening in 1948? War, threat of war, the atomic age was upon us. The Cold War was starting, right? And I remember as a young man, teenager, it was kind of the height of the Cold War. And you're kind of afraid. You never knew when, you felt like the bombs are going to start falling, the missiles. Here's what he writes, and he has something very, I think, powerful to say to us this morning. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read 2 paragraphs. I think it's very appropriate for what we're reading, or what we're going through right now. He says, in one way, we think a great deal too much about the atomic bomb. How are we to live in an atomic age? I'm tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century with the plague, visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in the Viking Age, when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or indeed, as you are already living in the age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, or an age of motor accidents. This is the first point to be made, and the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we're all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things, praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to friends over a pint and a game of darts, not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, but they need not dominate our minds. I think C.S. Lewis has something to say there. We may not have included the pint in there, but I think everything else in there. But that is really important. That, there's a lot of people who are scared. Mario, is this me or where's that sound coming from, Mike? Okay. Well, what we may need to do is, if I go to the podium. So I'm just going to cut this one off. All right. And, but right now there are a lot of panicked people out there and panicked over, they just want control. And it seems that toilet paper is their control. So I'm still trying to figure that one out. But anyways, C.S. Lewis's words, I think, are good to us. All right, I want to have some fun here for a second because I think a lot of people don't know who Patrick is, and so let's go through at least 5 myths. The first myth is Patrick is not a leprechaun. The second one, he is not Irish by birth. And while we're on this flag for half a second, and I'll explain more maybe later, everybody thinks that the color of Ireland is green. Well, I'm wearing orange here for a reason. We'll get into that in a moment. But you can see orange in the flag, it's there. Third myth. Let's see, I just lost control here. There we go. All right. Third myth. Patrick was not Catholic. Most people don't know that. The next one's going to surprise you maybe even more, but keep in mind, he's also not a saint. Well, it might go figure that if he's not Catholic, the Catholic Church is not going to make him a saint. So, and you're going to see in a few moments why they would not consider him Catholic. So, anyways, keep on going. Maybe some of you have heard about this one, that he taught the Trinity with the shamrock. That is something that only appeared about 1,000 years after his death, and so we think that is something we call hagiography. You kind of raise a person up to way more than they really are. So we think that is probably not true either. Although I suppose it's useful, it's a 3-in-1 illustration, but we don't think Patrick came up with that. The problem is that Patrick is an incredible person. And you're going to see that in a few moments. An incredible person. We don't know a lot about him, and unfortunately, a lot of the details that have been filled in, when this day shows up here, what is it, Tuesday, the 17th, St. Patrick's Day? People are going to be thinking that St. Patrick is nothing more than a leprechaun and time to drink green beer. And when we get to St. Patrick's Day, I want you to be thinking of a fantastic Christian missionary. And so I want to spend some time talking about him. A lot is debated about him. Now, we do have some of his writings. We do have some stuff about him. And we're going to be talking about some of that stuff. But we don't even know the exact year in which he was born. We know he lived in the 400s. We know when he was about 16, Celtic raiders came from Ireland and raided what we believe is now modern-day Scotland and captured him, took him back to Ireland, and he was a slave. And keep in mind, the Romans had gone back in the 400s. The Romans are having to go back to defend Rome. And so all havoc is breaking out. The barbarians are coming and attacking different areas, raiders. And Patrick was one of those victims. And so Patrick finds himself the slave of Druid chieftain. You've heard of the Druids. So Patrick is a slave of a Druid chieftain. And one of his jobs was herding pigs. And kind of like the prodigal son that Jesus talks about, Patrick had kind of taken his faith. He'd been raised a Christian, kind of taken his faith kind of for granted. But like the prodigal son, with time on his hands and time to think about it, he kind of says, refines his faith while he's tending sheep and pigs. And he says this, I would pray constantly during the daylight hours. The love of God and the fear of him surrounded me more and more, and faith grew. And the Spirit roused so that in one day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and at night only slightly less. So after 6 long years, Patrick has a dream. He believes it's a vision from God, telling him now's the time to escape, to go back home. So he escapes. It's a long journey, 200 miles on foot that he has to, Ireland's not that huge, but obviously if they catch him, it's probably the end of his life, because they don't like the idea of slaves escaping. And so Patrick finally makes his way to the coast, and he finds a captain that's going to take him to France, Glasgow, and Freedom has to kind of talk the captain into it because Patrick probably looks like a slave, and helping take escaped slaves is not the best thing to do for business, but he's able to finally talk his way onto the ship, and eventually, and there's more challenges that come along the way even before he gets home, but eventually he's able to make his way back home. Once he gets home, Patrick's conversion. He has decided, since he escaped, since he believes that God is with him, he needs to stay for the ministry. Keep in mind that his grandfather had been a priest, and his father had been a deacon. Now that should tell you something. We'll come to that a little bit later. But that his grandfather's a priest and has children. That's not a negative thing. But keep in mind, this is not a Roman faith. And we'll come to that in a few moments. So, remember let's go back. We went back too fast. Can we go back? I don't seem to have control here. There we go. That's good. So, he has a vision. And in his vision, he says there's this man who comes to him, a lot like Paul's vision of the man from Macedonia who's saying, come to Macedonia. Patrick has this vision, and he says, and his name was Victoricius, and he carried countless letters, and one of which he handed over to me, and I read aloud where it began, "The voice of the Irish." And as I began to read these words, I seemed to hear the voice of the same men who lived beside the forest of Forcol. And they cried out with one voice, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." He says, "I was deeply moved in heart, and I could read no further, so I awoke." One of the challenges with any story like this is that we start thinking, oh, isn't that special? He wants to go back to the same people who had enslaved him, and he wants to minister to them. But we forget, we don't treat our bosses like that. When our bosses are mean to us, we're like, you know what, if I can find another job, I'm finding another job, and I'm shaking the dust off my shoes as I leave this place. I'm not going back. I'm not giving this boss any more time. So why do we think that it would be any different for Patrick wanting to go back to Ireland? These are the same people who want to kill him. Okay? He's an escaped slave. They don't take kindly to that. And yet he's feeling the call to go back to these people who had captured him and enslaved him. And in case you're wondering, they didn't treat slaves that great either. The Druids, everything you know about the Druids, or you think you know, it's true. They weren't very nice people. They'd take their enemies' skulls, cut them in half, and use them as drinking bowls. These are not nice people. And yet Patrick is feeling the call to go back to these pagans, these barbarians who would like as much as anything to kill him. And that's what we got to keep in mind, who they are. Some of you know the story of Elizabeth Elliot. You maybe remember her husband, Jim Elliot. He was the mission pilot, and they went down to Ecuador, and they were trying to reach some unreached native tribe, the Auca Indians, and in the process, all 5 men were killed. And the incredible thing is, Elizabeth and another relative of one of the men killed, their families, they go back down to reach these same individuals who killed their loved ones. That's incredible. In fact, the story is even more incredible that one of the guys who killed, who actually killed the men, actually ends up becoming a Christian, baptizes one of the Elliot kids. That is amazing. That you can have that type of forgiveness. Like I said, we don't forgive our bosses. They don't try and kill us. We may think they're trying to work us to death, but they're not killing us. And yet, the Elliots and Patrick, they do this. Well, the amazing story is that when he goes back to Ireland, there's this beautiful woman with a lei, and it's like walking off the airplane when you land in Hawaii to greet him and say, "Welcome back to Ireland." Not. That did not happen at all. It's tough. I mean, can you imagine what you would do if you had to go back to a barbarian place and you got to figure out, how am I going to reach these people? How do you even get a toehold in this area to even launch a mission effort to these people? It's an incredible thing to do. They still want to kill him. I want to remind you what the Apostle Paul went through. This is why I like to call him the Apostle Paul of Ireland. Because remember, I already referenced, the Paul and the Macedonian vision. And you have Patrick and his vision with the Irishman. And Patrick also shares some other things too with Paul, besides fearlessness. Paul has this to say. He says, "I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. If we were to put that last sentence into modern language, we'd say the stress of pressure for the churches. Paul knows the challenge of trying to reach people who do not want to treat him nicely. That's Patrick's same problem. Behind me, you see a picture of a priest being protected from the Druids. And as I said, these people, the Druids, were notorious for violence. Notorious. At least one chieftain that Patrick witnessed to wanted to kill him. Fortunately, it's amazing. This would-be assassin later on is baptized. Listen to Patrick's words and see if you can't hear echoes of Paul. Daily I expect murder, fraud, or captivity. He's not writing about nice people. But I fear none of these things because of the promises of heaven. I have cast myself into the hands of God Almighty, who rules everywhere. And it seems in some ways, Patrick was fearless. Paul was fearless. Although, let's be honest, Paul, if you read Acts, 3 times in Acts, he says, pray that I might be bold. So Paul is not without that challenge. We often think that Paul just goes and charges any old challenge, but Paul prays that he wants the fellow believers to pray for him, that he could have boldness to do what he needed to do. I believe probably the same thing with Patrick, that he also needed them to pray for his boldness. Patrick says, I must take this decision disregarding risks involved and make known the gifts of God and its everlasting consolation. Neither must we fear any such risk in faithfully preaching God's name boldly in every place, so that even after my death, a spiritual legacy may be left for my brethren and my children. So the big question is, Patrick is not the first missionary to Ireland. There had been other ones before him, but it really hadn't gone anywhere. So why is Patrick successful in Ireland and the other missionaries had not been? And I think the answer to this is, remember Joseph? Joseph is taken to Egypt. And what does he tell his brothers when he finally reveals himself to them? He says, yeah, exactly, you meant this for evil, but God has turned it for good. I think that's the same thing that happened to Patrick. That he's taken as a slave. He lives with him for 6 years. He's a slave of a chieftain. Patrick is smart. He's able to figure out Irish society. And he figures out you got to address the chieftains. And so that was Patrick's major witness. I mean, he would talk to everybody, but his major witness was to go and talk to the chieftains and to witness to them. And that was an amazing thing. In fact, it's reported that his former master, a guy by the name of Michu, eventually became a Christian as well. But sometimes when you and I are in challenging circumstances, maybe we need to pause for a moment and say, okay, what's God going to do with this? What's God going to do with this? I can't see it right now, but how does God take my present situation and eventually turn it, what was meant originally for evil, to turn it to good for God's power? Patrick is not solely responsible, as you're going to see in a few moments, for converting all of Ireland. There were other missionaries who came after him. But it's amazing how he started out. But I also want to share with you other background to his success And here's one of the amazing things about him. He was passionate about the Bible. Patrick is 1,000 years before the Protestant Reformation. Think about this. He's doing sola scriptura, which was a major tenet of the Protestant Reformation, 1,000 years before them. And you're going to see how that impacts Ireland in a second. The second thing is, he's not going on, what are the fathers saying, what's tradition saying? He's saying, what does the Bible say? And meanwhile, back on the continent, Christianity is going off the tracks. You think about the Dark Ages. We call it the Dark Ages. During this time, Christianity starts taking some really unfortunate turns on the continent. Ireland is different. It is not going off the tracks like the continent went. Look at this. And by the way, this book here, excellent book. Leslie Harding, some of you know him. He was an Adventist theologian. This book is excellent. It says, wherever Patrick established a church, he's believed to have left a copy of the books of the law and the books of the Gospels. And there's a major difference between him and the Roman church. It says, unlike the Roman Christians who appealed more and more to teachings of the church and the councils, the Celtic Christians stressed the Bible. Very different type of missionary. There's no indication for at least 2 centuries after Patrick that they're trying to invoke the angels or the saints. So I think it's rather ironic that we call him St. Patrick, because Patrick would have not been comfortable with that. But while the Celtic theologian was keenly interested in the whole of Scriptures, his preoccupation with the 10 Commandments was even deeper. He has this passion, and he's very different than the Roman church. In fact, when the Roman church will come in the 700s and 800s, several hundred years later, they won't at first be well accepted. They kind of had to force their way into Ireland, because the Church of Ireland, the church that Patrick had helped start, is a very different faith. It's a biblical faith versus what later came around. One of the other things too, and that is, let's go back one. He and his fellow missionaries, they taught righteousness by faith. Because yes, he's leaving a copy of the law. There's, they're passionate about the 10 Commandments, but they're also teaching righteousness by faith, that salvation comes by Christ's righteousness, not by our works, 1,000 years, again, before the Protestant Reformation. He's an amazing man to be doing all this. And here's something else that is amazing. Take, for instance, you think about the Irish today, and we think maybe the Irish Republican Army. We think, short tempers. We think, all the traditional, maybe stereotypical Irish things that come to mind. People who, you cross an Irishman and he's going to have 2 fists in your face. But here's the amazing thing. The Irish were the first major people group to be converted without violence. Think about that. Converted through persuasion. Now, compare what's happening with the Roman church, with the conquistadors. It's the priest and the gun. And we have that in our American history in the Southwest, Latin America, the priest and the gun. And yet the Irish, in the 400s, are converted with not the same way, through just simple persuasion, presenting the gospel. Patrick believed in the soon second coming. He wrote, "We look for his coming soon, to judge the quick and the dead. He believed that they were living in the last days. He had a passion. And in many ways, he kind of sounds like us, doesn't he? You know? And by the way, there's something else, too, that is a little bit mixed up. And I don't want to we could spend the rest of our time just talking about this. But Patrick was married. Remember I said his grandfather had been a priest? They didn't have the same Platonic Christian view of the body that is so prevalent in our society today. You and I believe in the Judeo-Christian view of the body, that together we're created in God's image, that the body, that we are a living soul. The Judeo-Christian view, the body is the temple. We're created to enjoy the senses, and that married life was created for enjoyment. It's very different than the Platonic Christian view of the body. The Platonic Christian view of the body says body's the devil's playground, that you got to subdue the senses, and that marriage is only for the weak. And it's a very different look. In fact, the Roman church years later would try to explain away the fact that Patrick was married. They would say, well, they were living as brother and sister. And you're going, but where's that coming from? That's coming from this Platonic view of the body. Body bad, mind good. That is so prevalent in our society. And here's one of the other great differences between Patrick and the later Celtic church, the Roman church. Next slide. There we go. The Celtic church kept the Sabbath, Friday evening to Saturday evening, sometimes to early Sunday morning. Later he would say, this was later written after Patrick, we are bidden to work on 6 days, but the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, we are restrained from every servile work or labor. Columba is a fascinating figure. If there was a person that was basically almost up to Patrick's status, I would say it's Columba. Another great missionary to Ireland who came after Patrick. And when he was about to pass away, this is what he said. And I just love it. So this day is called in the sacred books Sabbath, which is interpreted rest. And truly this day is for me a Sabbath because it is my last day of my laborious life. I love that picture of these people who are saying Sabbath is special, sola scriptura, that righteousness by faith, the Sabbath. There's one other thing too that tells you what happened. When the Roman church came into Ireland, they had a Sabbath problem they had to deal with. So how do you get rid of the Sabbath when they came in? Well, I call it the Lucky Charms version. Rather than arguing from the Bible, I'm saying they argue from Lucky Charms' perspective. And here's what I mean by this. They said, here begins the epistle of the Savior of our Lord Jesus Christ concerning the Lord's day, which in his own hand wrote in the presence of the men of heaven, and which was placed upon the altar of Peter the apostle in Rome of Latium, to make Sunday holy for all time. So what's he saying by this? He's saying, rather than saying, let's argue from the Bible, no. This command to keep Sunday was written in heaven and somehow magically appeared on the altar in Rome. That's what they're saying, to argue against the Sabbath. And that's what I'm saying, it's the Lucky Charms version. You know, it's also just as biblically unnutritious. Goes on. Therefore, it is through these commands that God has enjoined Sunday to be kept holy, for God's own hand has written that command to men, lest they should do either work or servile labor on Sunday. There would be no need for them to say this unless Sabbath was being kept in Ireland. And so this is another evidence of what Patrick and the missionaries who followed him had been doing while they were in Ireland. Sadly, the Celtic church was not as organized, and so when the Roman church came in the 700s and 800s, they were gradually took over, and now we see today, very few vestiges of Patrick. And that's why today, unfortunately, we celebrate St. Patrick's Day with leprechauns and other things that have nothing to do with who Patrick really was. And so I'm hoping that as the 17th comes up, that you think about St. Patrick, that you're thinking about this great guy. But I don't want to just leave it right there. I want to challenge you. Because a few years ago, I heard this story about this woman in Tunisia. This woman in Tunisia, and we heard about Adventist World Radio. And I don't know if she heard about Christianity and Adventism through Adventist World Radio. I don't know what method she heard about it. But as you know, Tunisia is it's 98% Muslim. But she decided she wanted to become an Adventist. And like Patrick, she's having to sacrifice to do that. She and her husband had been professors at a university. Well, that was the first thing that cost her. Well, as you become a Christian, sorry, you lost your job. Then her husband says, no, I don't want you for my wife. I don't want a Christian wife. And then he's trying to take the children. I don't know what her fate is to this day. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you her name and how things have worked out for her. I don't know. But I am inspired by somebody like her who's willing to put it all on the line. I'm inspired by others like Patrick who are saying, I am fearlessly going to go to these same people who are going to kill me. And as we are here today, you and I are going to deal with challenges too. We don't live in a neighborhood that's super Christian friendly anymore. It's almost a weird thing when you have friends and neighbors say, hey, tell me about it. And I'm going to ask you to pray for me because I have a neighbor who knows I'm a pastor. He and I have talked numerous times. And he says, Jim, I want to know more about your church. So pray for me. Pray for me about this as I witness to him. But with this, I want to challenge all of us that we can have the spirit of Patrick, that we can have the spirit of this unnamed woman, that we can have the spirit of the Elliots, that we are willing to put it on the line and to go where God is calling us to go. So may we of the Concord Church be the modern day Patricks of Ireland in our community.